is. Okay. Oh yeah, people are coming in. Hello, everyone. This is the time that we usually talk about the weather, right? Which actually looks like it's going to be getting nicer in Chicago.
Oh, that's nice.
I think it's going to be in the 70s on Saturday.
Oh, I'm jealous.
Well, we kind of owe it to ourselves. We made it through another winter.
That's fair.
Where are you, Asmina?
I am in Boston. So the cherry blossoms are in full bloom.
Nice.
It's actually really nice in the spring here.
I grew up in Boston, and I was actually
You
just there.
did?
Yeah, I was visiting my parents this past weekend, so I was just in Boston like Friday through
that's
Sunday.
amazing. Well, the next time you're here, we got to catch up in person.
I think I didn't
had no
realize you were
idea.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, I had no idea that you grew up in Boston. Oh, that's awesome.
I think I assumed you were in Chicago for whatever reason. I don't know why, Asmina.
Oh, that's funny. I mean, I was like 4 years ago.
It's because over Zoom you can be anywhere and nowhere all at once.
We're everywhere.
Exactly.
So we'll get started at 12:30, which is about 2 minutes from now. Let's see. Was it McKinsey that took you to Boston, Asmina?
Yes. Yeah. I moved after I finished ID. And I've been here since.
Okay, got it. So how does Boston compare to Chicago?
Oh, I get this. I'm asked this very often. I think they're both very different. I definitely miss being in Chicago. But I like that there are more seasons in Boston. Like it has a real spring, a real fall. The winters are pretty much very similar, but the one thing I like about Boston is it's a very walkable city.
Yeah.
It's so small. So I enjoy going on a lot of long walks.
That was a real shocker for me coming from the East Coast, because I spent all of my growing up years there in college, and the first year out of growing up, college, and then the first year post, I guess, and then I came out to Chicago. And yeah, Chicago sprawls. Like,
it's so big.
It's endless. I had no idea until I moved here.
Yeah.
All right, so we have people coming in still, but I'm going to just give a little bit of an introduction to the Institute of Design and let you know what we're about. So at the Institute of Design, we look at the world in new ways to create the change we hope to see in it. Since our founding by Bauhaus immigrant Laszlo Moholy-Nagy in 1937, our goal has been to turn design into a powerful tool anyone can use. Our graduates use design to transform the systems that shape our lives, from cities, education, and finance to food, healthcare, and technology. Today, we are the only US design school devoted completely to graduate students, and we are the first to offer a PhD in design. We unite science and rigor with creativity and rapid iteration, and we're pioneers in applying design to the real world. Here, both learners and leaders observe the systems to envision the new worlds they can build from them. Please reach out to us if you're interested in any of our graduate programs. Right now, we are still accepting applications for our MDM program. That's the Master of Design Methods program, which we consider an alternative to an MBA. And we have lots more content on that, but that's not for today. Although I will point out that we do offer that program both part-time and online. So if you're in Boston, you can still do our MDM program, for instance. And today we're talking specifically about behavioral design with ID Associate Professor Ruth Schmidt and ID alum Asmina Shaikh. Asmina, did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Great. But many of you may not be familiar with what behavioral design is. So Asmina and Ruth, could you each start us off by offering an example of behavioral design in the world today? Asmina, I'll ask you to go first.
Great. So I think we see a lot of examples of behavioral design around us. A lot of the technology we use today uses behavioral science to sort of continually influence or change our behaviors. An example that comes to mind is, and this is not necessarily a tech example, but more so kind of a program, is Google's food program. So for those who are not familiar, if you work at Google, you actually have a really sort of fancy like cafeteria. They have a lot of visiting chefs that come and do a lot of different kinds of menus. And the way this program is designed was actually an employment engagement strategy under the hood. So the idea is that, you know, if you have good food around you, available to you easily in your office, that actually would motivate people to kind of bump into each other. So they were trying to, you know, recreate these sort of water cooler moments so people meet each other more often, because Google also has massive offices. And so it's kind of hard to meet people who you don't work with on a day-to-day basis. So this is a really great example of how, you know, a simple thing like good food and easy access to good food totally changed how people, you know, how you meet people in your office. So that's another, you know, that's a good example of how you might use behavioral science to change people's behaviors. And another super common example that we probably heard about is how people make the decision to sort of make, you know, contributions to their retirement funds, which is a 401k program in the US, right? So when you start, for those of you, you know, who aren't familiar with this, when you start a job, you're automatically enrolled into an account that, you know, and your company will sort of make a contribution that matches sort of your contribution. And it's an opt-in model as opposed to opt-out. So it's on by default, right? You're automatically enrolled into it. So it adds just more effort for people to actually, you know, not contribute to the program. So by making it sort of automatic, it's easy for people to kind of not think about it and just sort of have, you know, money go towards your retirement planning and retirement fund. And that was actually one of the first sort of early examples of how you might think about applying behavioral science. Ruth, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, just adding on to that, as I was trying to think about like, oh, what's the one example? It's almost hard to think about an industry or a company that doesn't have behavioral science behind it these days. That can be industries and companies from healthcare, helping you select healthcare plans, for example. As Mina described, retirement savings, but financial services company like Morningstar has a whole behavioral science group behind it. Lyft and Uber do. So there are lots of companies, even consumer ones like Target, Walmart, et cetera, likely have a behavioral sciences team behind them. But you also find behavioral science increasingly in like public policy settings. So COVID, obviously, which we've all lived through and continue to live through, many of the nudges and prompts to do things like wear masks have been influenced by behavioral science, or certainly there's been a ton of work, even pre-COVID, about vaccinations. Right? How do you encourage people to get vaccinations through messaging or framing things, or even just providing enough information so they know where to go? But increasingly, there are also products and offerings. So two that people may be familiar with, there are commercials these days frequently for Noom, which is a weight loss program, which like broadcasts its grounding in behavioral science. And similarly, Lemonade is an insurance product, which also Dan Ariely is behind. He's a very well-known behavioral scientist. So we have a lot of examples like that. And it was also occurring to me that there are kind of negative examples of behavioral design in the world as well. Like anyone who has ever tried to cancel a gym membership has run into like behavioral design for evil. They usually make it super hard, where you sometimes have to like write a letter, put it in an envelope, and put on a stamp. And those are all examples of dark patterns, yes, which I see in the chat, or what's sometimes called sludge. So we see it kind of everywhere these days. There are a lot of both commercial and civic organizations and efforts that use behavioral science, oftentimes for good, hopefully for good, but yeah, sometimes to actually make it a little bit more difficult, like to access programs and things like that. So once you start looking for it, you actually start to see it pretty much everywhere, I would say.
Great. So thank you for giving us those introductions. I wanted to also just back up and just ask everyone if you can put your, if you have questions through the session, if you can actually put them in the Q&A section as opposed to the chat, because we'll just have an easier time of managing them there. And then also to introduce Sandhini, who's here today, and she'll be managing our Q&A session that will happen toward the end of the session. So looking forward to that, but let's first go to our next question now that we kind of have an initial handle on what a behavioral design is. Asmina, can you talk to us about how you were first introduced to behavioral design? How did you get into this work?
Yes, there's a very straightforward answer to that question. I was actually introduced to behavioral design at ID when I took Ruth's class. Ruth, you taught intro to behavioral science. I was, I think, in my second year at ID. And really, that was the first time when I had taken sort of any kind of formal learning in behavioral science. At the time, I think we had books like Predictably Irrational. I think the first edition of Nudge was also available. So there were definitely a lot of these books that were popular at the time. This is, again, happening in the wake of sort of post 2008, the economic crisis during the 2008 crash. And so I was sort of familiar, had kind of bumped into these ideas. I was familiar with the books, but Ruth's class was really sort of a formal introduction to, what is behavioral science. And I was primarily interested in taking that class because I'd been studying at the time a lot of user research methods and trying to understand human behavior more deeply. And one of the things that attracted me to this class was, oh, there is actually a field of science that, helps us understand human behavior. And I was like, well, I do need to know and learn about this. And so that was when we were kind of introduced to some very basic, the COM-B model, which is really trying to understand, like, breaking down behaviors into a combination of like capabilities, opportunities, and motivation, and kind of how do you start to study human behavior from a scientific perspective, and kind of going through some documented theories about, how do our brains, trying to understand when humans start to do sort of irrational things, that there is actually a reason behind why we might behave in that irrational manner, and try and understand these sort of effects that people had, long studied, but it was just sort of a very, very good complementary field for me to study as a designer, who's somebody who's, dealing with humans and researching human behaviors on an almost daily basis.
And Ruth, how about you? How were you introduced to behavioral design?
So it was also around 2008-ish for me. I was actually a student at the Institute of Design. I was getting my master's right around that time. And Asmina, you described that as kind of this opening in some ways. That was around the time that behavioral science went from being more of an academic subject to something that was more popularly available and recognizable. And similarly, I found it such a beautiful complement, because at the time, I mean, design, as we teach it at ID, is still grounded in human-centeredness to a large degree. But the human-centeredness that we think about in the design and design research is really about getting lots of data points about what it is to live right now, right here, with real people in front of you, and understanding their lives and their contexts. So it's a very specific way of understanding what's important and how we need to be solving for certain kinds of problems, and even if we're solving for the right problems. And what behavioral science brings, which was eye-opening, and again, like I found it beautifully complementary, was really more insight into what it is like to be human. Because that entire field of behavioral science research is really about understanding, and I use rationality in quotes because there are debates about whether we're really irrational or whether it's just that our brains are constructed to deal with the fact that we cannot possibly process all the information coming at us in the same way at the same time. We're just not built for that. And it's not because human beings are broken, it's just because our brains prioritize certain things over others. We make big generalizations because it's a way that we can navigate the world more easily. But it also means that we fall into these predictable patterns that are sometimes less useful. And it means that we can exclude certain types of information or evidence that we really shouldn't. So at the time, around 2008 or so, I think it was just dumb luck to a large extent. I was very excited by this connection. I was in a space where I could actually dedicate my time and attention to it because I was getting my master's degree. And so I basically turned my whole second year into like a deep dive into behavioral design. I accidentally met Dan Ariely at some point, who I already mentioned because a friend of mine happened to be working with him. So it was just sort of this beautiful confluence of things. And frankly, at the time, it was a lot easier, I think, to kind of get involved and get ramped up, because to do that now, there's just like a much bigger curve. There's just more data, more experimentation, more stuff out there. But the idea of coupling behavioral science with design, I think both of us were, sort of telling similar versions of that story, where the more that we understand about the context and the real humans, but coupling that with understanding why people process information and make choices that may not seem good for them, and yet they predictably do, it means that we're better designers. And also just one quick thing, because I realize we're using the term behavioral design a lot. I always think of it not as designing behavior. And Asmina, I don't know if you have a similar perspective, but sometimes people think like, oh, we're kind of puppet mastering folks.
Mm-hmm.
I think of it much more like we're designing conditions that support behavior. So we're not designing what people do, we're just making it easier, or sometimes putting barriers in their way, like positive friction, to keep them from doing things that maybe they do a little too easily. But as designers, we're never designing the people, we're designing the conditions themselves.
Great. So, yeah, maybe Asmina, you can speak to that, and then also to why and how you found, in specific projects, et cetera, like that behavioral science and design pair so well together.
Yeah, so kind of building a little bit on what Ruth, what you were saying, I think I definitely agree with you that I don't like to think about it as designing behaviors, because it has this like weird, ominous, feeling to it. One way that I like to describe that further is thinking about, in the world of design, we're trained to think about what do people need, right? And when we talk about people's needs, we talk about sort of the needs that they can describe, but then there's also this category of sort of unmet needs, so needs that people cannot articulate, but you can sort of see and kind of guess, right? And I think I like to think about behavioral design as that as a sort of additional lever that you can use to kind of understand people's needs a little bit better. So you're and also understand how people might behave in certain situations, and use that sort of deeper understanding to build things for people or to design for people. And so instead of thinking about it as sort of you're controlling what people do or how people behave, you're kind of actually using this more informed lens to design for what people actually need, right? And so that's the kind of distinction between using behavioral design versus sort of designing for designing behaviors. And in terms of kind of why design and behavioral science have this sort of natural overlap that we, and they complement really well, that as we've described before. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about design is that it sort of forces us to think about the bigger picture, right? We often define problems in the world of design really broadly, and we often take the super high level view of any context, any problem. And I think behavioral science it has a really interesting complement to this, which is to kind of dig deeper and find those sort of micro patterns almost in human behavior. So while design is giving you this sort of bigger picture view of the people involved in the, of the context, behavioral science is actually, giving you that healthy tension of saying, okay, now let's understand the people better, their behaviors better, and in a somewhat sort of deeper way in at a micro level. And so I think in terms of like when you think about the depth that you can create or go into, behavioral science actually I think has helped me understand and go deeper into understanding the context, understanding the people that we're designing for. So in that way, they have this really they both these fields have tools to help you do that, and as a result, you end up kind of covering a much broader and deeper space. Yeah, I think I'll pause there. Ruth, I'm curious to hear how you see it.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree. And I think there's, in some ways, of course, we're saying kind of similar things in terms of that complementarity. I also think you use the word tension, and I think that's really interesting too, because I think in some way fields can help each other to kind of expand and grow in a really useful way. So design, for example, is sometimes, it's considered sort of a creative endeavor. And I would argue, okay, at ID, we do actually try to introduce methods and rigor to help do that. But we also are very willing often to sort of say, well, what could be? Like, let's know what we know and build on that and speculate about how we could design, for example, a better future or a better solution. But coupling that with what behavioral science or behavioral design offers, which is like, that's great, but let's ground it in real data. Let's make sure that we're testing our ideas. Like, that's a really wonderful connection. But similarly, kind of to the other direction, where behavioral science can sometimes focus really specifically on kind of what do we know, how can we prove things, how do we focus on more discrete behavioral change. If you couple that with design and then sort of pull that into a behavioral design setting, behavioral designers who are trained in design can say like, well, let's look at that kind of change in the system context that we're going to be in. So something that works super well in a lab may not work well in a real life context. One of my favorite examples of that, because I was an innovation consultant for many years between graduating and then coming back as a professor at ID, is I was working with organizations that would say, we tell our people to be innovative, but people aren't innovative. What are we doing wrong? Why don't they listen? Why is nobody doing what we're telling them to do? And you'd sit down and you'd figure out what was actually going on in that company. And it was like every single lever and every single motivation and every single incentive was designed almost to do the opposite. It was designed to keep people acting and being rewarded by really short-term measures. So that was a case where, like, even if you thought about using behavioral science to maybe adjust people's individual behaviors, design by nature is going to be looking at that whole environment and going to be saying, like, that's great that you want people to be innovative, but here are the 10 ways in which the environment you've created is actually working against your goals. So therefore, how do we think about how to change that? How do we think about what are the variety of levers that you might need, not just focusing on that behavioral change, but kind of understanding the larger picture context. So yeah, so I think they're both complementary, sort of, like, sometimes call them strange bedfellows in the sense that sort of good together, even though they're kind of going at different things, but they're also great at stirring each other out of the comfort zone that may be a little bit too comfy, right? Sometimes that means that we don't actually expand on what we need to do.
Great. So Ruth had spoken about, like, how coming into behavioral design at, I think that moment that you said was, Ruth, maybe around 2008 or so, and how it was a different picture then than it is now. And so, Asmina, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, the picture as it is now, or when you came out of school a few years ago, and what bringing behavioral design looked like, going into McKinsey.
Yeah, that's yes. So after I graduated from ID, I joined McKinsey originally as a communication designer. And at the time, I was hired into this team called the Technology and Digital Change team at McKinsey, which is primarily responsible for kind of product adoption and internal marketing of a lot of the technology products and services that are used by McKinsey employees. So really, if you think about it, it was about helping people understand what are the set of tools in technology that's sort of available for them to do their jobs and serve McKinsey's clients, right? And I sort of entered this world. At the time, the team didn't have a very well established sort of design research practice. And so kind of going in from ID, I was super excited about, bringing kind of design research originally to this team. Over time, it was very clear that as we started to learn about, why are people, not having trouble using this particular product, or why is it that, people are having a harder time changing their mindset to kind of doing things one way to now, doing things a different way using this different tool. And as we started to dig deeper into these kinds of questions, it was very clear that there were a lot of behavioral effects at play. And I was like, wait, I have another set of sort of toolkit, that I kind of like delved into a little bit in grad school that I think has a lot of real opportunity to kind of apply and explore here. And so that's how I kind of started my journey of, establishing this behavioral design practice and bringing, trying to find sort of every opportunity that I could get to bring behavioral science and behavioral design into trying to understand people's behaviors around, using technology better. So really, it was this very organic process of like, I think that behavioral science can help. It was a hunch I had, right, at the time, and having been sort of exposed to it a little bit in school, it was when I was doing a lot of user research, working with user researchers and product managers and engineers to kind of understand what a product is, what's the ecosystem that the product is going to live in. Behavioral design kind of helped us really articulate those behavior changes that our colleagues would have to go through in order to sort of be more productive, be more impactful in their work. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about how, what behavioral design helped me do was better articulate kind of what were the changes that we wanted to see in the firm and in the people that we were sort of designing for. it was definitely an uphill battle because initially, when I joined the team, it was like, oh, what is, talk to us about how design can help. And then suddenly, think about this, about a year later, I was now talking about behavioral design, which was sort of yet another thing for people to get comfortable with. And so it was, but I think the more we could sort of break down the jargon and really talk about the value that behavioral design could, bring to our work and actually demonstrate, the how it could help. I think applying it to sort of real projects, think about, one of the things that is one of my favorite examples to share is we were trying to help adopt a new sort of email software in the company. And even though that was sort of a very forced change, because it was like, all right, our contract is up, we're gonna just sort of switch to a new thing. There was a lot of work that went into getting people comfortable and trying to find, okay, you organize your emails into folders, one way, this is how you're gonna do it using the new tool. And really thinking about, what were the workarounds people had built using this previous tool, and how can we sort of help them identify how to, do the same things, or use that as an opportunity to break some bad habits and build some new ones, right? And so that was one of my favorite sort of examples of kind of using behavioral science to design these sort of what we call programs. And that was, once leaders in the company could see actual changes happening, like change in how, people used email at the company, that was when they were like, and wait, so how did we do this again? That is how we were able to have this conversation about this approach works, right? And so it was a sort of slow process of getting buy-in that behavioral science has a little bit of the secret sauce to make things happen. But until you could sort of apply that and demonstrate that, it was kind of harder for people to sort of get behind, like, yay, behavioral science. So yeah, I think that's sort of my story in short.
Well, just quickly piggybacking on something that you were just describing too, because it's very similar to my own experience. Having using behavioral design and findings from behavioral science can help de-risk certain things. And so you can't assume that everyone is always going to read every piece of documentation. You can't always assume that people are going to sort of do, again, the rational thing that you expect them to do, but understanding where they're likely to get in their own way or where there are likely to be challenges, whether that's internally facing, like the story you just described, or whether it's towards consumers, customers, citizens, plays sort of a similar role. It just means that we can have a little bit more insight into like what's likely to not make this work, and therefore how can we kind of proactively design something that's going to make sense, that doesn't, the go-to sometimes it's like, well, we'll just send them more information, more details about why this is smart or good or whatever to use. And that is almost guaranteed to not work because we're all, consumed with so much content already. But that ability to kind of proactively think ahead can be super helpful, I think.
Yeah, I think something that kind of triggered a thought in my head. I think one other thing that I've observed behavioral science to really sort of help with is sort of identifying those risky behaviors. And this particular sort of value that behavioral science provides of like, how are people going to behave in certain situations? We can use that understanding to actually prevent certain risky behaviors. And this, as you can imagine, in any big corporate company, right, is extremely valuable when you think about things like, cybersecurity and risk management and reputation management for a company. So that is the other lever that I think as designers, we're able to say that, oh, if I'm able to conduct this research, I can actually better understand how people might I don't know, hit reply all in an email that's going to expose some confidential data, and sort of how can we prevent those kinds of blunders from being sort of happening, right? And so not only is it sort of helping us foresee that what people might do, but it's also a really important sort of tool to help us prevent things from happening, prevent risky behavior.
So Asmina, you talked a little bit about, how you use behavioral design at your work at McKinsey, and it sounds to me like it's a lot about, accomplishing certain or improving certain experiences for employees, and helping them along in adopting different technologies and behaviors. Ruth and Asmina, but maybe Ruth first, could you talk about different ways or different industries that might use behavioral design in different ways?
So first of all, different in terms of industries that use it, probably it's hard to find any that don't at this point. I think it's more often than not anything where there's going to be, I sometimes this may sound a little flippant, but basically anywhere there are people, there's behavior. And so whether again, it's sort of more of an internal facing thing or externally, my personal examples tend to come from three particular fields. I did a lot of work in healthcare, financial services, and education. And so just, looking at those three, for example, in both healthcare, actually in all three to some degree, but healthcare and financial services in particular, we can start to see certain types of patterns emerge, which are often signals for the need for behavioral thinking or behavioral perspectives. So one very clear challenge in both of those fields, healthcare and financial services, is the tension between present tense decisions and present tense behaviors and future tense outcomes. So it's a reason, for example, why people don't save money for their old age or retirement. It's the reason why people eat cookies and donuts rather than apples and going for a run, right? Like those things seem super smart, and yet it's very tempting to have that piece of cake that's on the counter rather than do things which are going to be better for our long-term health. So that's a case where some of these short-term, long-term, or what's sometimes called like hot and cold state or planner-doer models can kick in, where we know better, and yet we allow our more impulsive selves to do the things that aren't really smart, because it's much, much harder to know who that future person is going to be. So what's interesting about that, and again, Asmina, not sure if you run into this situation too, once you're in this field for a certain amount of time, you can also start to sense patterns like that, like certain types of challenges, for example, where, in contrast with what I just described with healthcare and financial services, sometimes starting something new is the real challenge, because that is also a behavioral issue. It's often difficult to, if you're going to try to be running a marathon, for example, you can't really start from like sitting on the couch to running a marathon. You have to go through all sorts of intermediate steps. But if you don't have that structure or that planning, it's really hard to know what to do. So that's also a case where behavioral design in any kind of industry, right? Any situation where people are confronted by this tension between, I know I should, but I don't know what that first step is. Thinking about what are ways that we can give people a head start or give them structures to even just run around the block first, for example, can be very, very helpful. So on the one hand, I think there are probably industry specific things that are going to be relevant and important that just show up more, for example, in certain types of industries. But increasingly, I actually think, and especially maybe this is me and my designer mind, which likes to synthesize across things, recognizing where there are these kind of predictable patterns or predictable types of behaviors that show up frequently that we kind of need to keep our eyes on, because solving, in one individual situation may actually give us insight into a different one. So, these behavioral patterns, I think, start to exist in all sorts of areas, both in terms of long-term, short-term trade-offs, in terms of getting started, in terms of keeping habits going. That's like another well-known challenge, right? How do you maintain a habit after you've started? So those are just kind of a handful of areas that it tends to show up quite a bit.
Yeah, and I know, Ruth, you mentioned kind of these patterns that we see, and kind of how do we either leverage that or identify those to kind of work around them, right? I think one of these big patterns that we're observing generally in the world today is the sort of shift to the shift of in balance from over indexing on sort of human activity to computer activity, right? So if you think about like the prevalence of like AI and machine learning, and a lot of the work that used to be done by humans is now being done by machines, or at least we're trending in that direction. I think one of the things that becomes really relevant when you encounter such a situation is thinking about what decisions used to be made by humans that are now being made by machines. Like, what choices are we eliminating for people by giving, by relying on algorithms to make these choices for us? And I think at that point, it is important. One of the things that behavioral design can help us do is sort of identify these critical moments where a human decision becomes actually more critical than it used to be, because we are eliminating choices for humans like along the way. So that's sort of a big pattern that we're observing in the world today, where behavioral design can actually help us identify more of these sort of critical moments that we might not think about otherwise. And then I know we talked about sort of building new habits. One of my other examples for this is, during COVID times, and actually, and now sort of, I don't know that we can say we're post COVID yet, but at least past the sort of super severe peaks, where now, as you're seeing, a lot of the people are moving into sort of these hybrid working environments where partially, some people are working remotely, some people are in person, and now you have to find a routine for yourself where you're able to sort of comfortably collaborate with people in person as well as in a remote setting, right? And so a lot of companies have had to actually help their employees figure out what are the new habits that you're going to have to build to actually make the hybrid working model a success. So there might be things that you might need to do that you didn't do otherwise because everybody went to the office, but now we're not really doing that. And there are, how do you communicate over Zoom? Right now, we're in a completely sort of virtual setting, and there's a set of norms that we've developed. But as we sort of move into this more hybrid working model, what are the new norms, right? How do I make sure I don't sort of talk over people, which is a thing that we all had to kind of get used to when we, suddenly all started working on remotely and virtually. So what are the sort of these new norms that we're going to have to develop as we move into this more a hybrid working setting has been kind of a big area where we're seeing sort of understanding there's just a completely new set of behaviors that we're going to have to account for and design for, right, to make this model a success.
Yeah, and just very, very quickly piggybacking on that, because I know we're probably going to go to the Q&A shortly,
Yeah.
but yeah, that notion of both technology and there's a term called like the tyranny of automation that I've heard also, which is very much in line with what you're describing when it comes to things like AI and machine learning, where by outsourcing or by trusting other types of technologies to do the decision-making and judgment-making in some cases, it really puts us in this interesting position where recognizing that machine learning and AI sometimes contribute their own sense of biases. So where are we compensating for human biases by just, thinking of, okay, now they're resident in technology or in a machine is one thing we need to be thinking about. But absolutely, I mean, very few of us probably at this stage remember phone numbers anymore because our phones do it for us. So even in what feels like a kind of benign way, the way in which we trust technology and make use of technology, or absolutely when you describe things like Zoom or how we sort of, encounter or deal with one another in terms of mediated by technology, those kinds of activities, it's really interesting. And I think like if anything, because that will continue to increase, some of the issues that behavioral design, the issues that are raised by some of these questions, I think will continue to inform not just how we interact, but also how designers think about, what makes sense. How do we help design better systems, better structures, better offerings that can blindly stumble into some of these things, but to actually be more thoughtful about it, because there are real implications, whether it's education, healthcare, anything. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
So I am going to move, as Ruth mentioned, to Q&A. And so Sandhini's going to manage our Q&A. And just to let everyone know, we did get a bunch of questions from registrants ahead of time. So we're going to field some of those. We're also going to pay attention to the Q&A section here. I anticipate that there will be a lot of overlap between the questions that are in the Q&A section and that are that we received ahead of time. I'll also try to answer whichever ones I can in the Q&A section, just by typing. So feel free to put those in there and try to put them in the Q&A section, like I said, and not the chat, because they're just a lot easier for us to manage that way. So I'm going to turn it over to Sandhini, who will lead us through this Q&A section, and look forward to hearing some of these great questions.
Thanks, Kristin. Thank you, Asmina and Ruth, for sharing all those insights about behavioral design and how it works, and giving us such great examples. As we in this current world, design is not just about feasibility, viability, and usability, but we're also shifting our focus on ethicality and legal, how to ensure it's sustainable and legal. So along those lines, we've received a lot of questions about how can behavioral design be ethical, and how do we ensure that so Asmina, if you can describe how in your work you've ensured that organizations use behavioral design in an ethical sense, rather than using the concepts of behavioral science for manipulating or hooking people or audiences for commercial benefits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a really interesting aspect, I think, of being in this field. I think one of the first things that comes to mind is, as a designer, I'd say, not just as a behavioral designer, but as a designer in general, I think we're aware that we have the sort of responsibility to advocate for our users, right? However you might define our users and stakeholders. And so in my experience, what I've observed is that often, we have to have a sort of special focus on kind of weighing the pros and cons of the things that are, the strategies that are being talked about and the ideas that are being sort of discussed, and really use sort of some kind of a holistic framework to weigh whether, a thing might provide value or not, and to whom, right? Like, are we really just talking about solving for business problems, or are we also in turn, thinking about the people that are going to be impacted by the solution? And so the question of ethics is really sort of, how is your internal ethical framework wired, I think, is how I'd best describe it. Often the responsibility for thinking about these things falls on the individuals that are in the room. There's definitely an argument to be made here about inclusion, which is who is actually in the room, and being sort of mindful and thoughtful about do we have the right voices in the room, or what voices are missing from these rooms, and who actually has the ability to make certain high level decisions, and whether or not, when we're talking about are we being inclusive in how we define our audiences for the problems that we're trying to solve. But again, I think that there definitely seems to be an opportunity, at least in the corporate world, to think about this from a DEI lens, so diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, which I can say, like, there's been a bigger push in the recent years for companies to sort of think about this and act on it, more importantly, not just think about these, right? But I do think that there might be opportunities in the world of sort of design and behavioral design to have some kind of a central approach to this. I think that whether it is I know that at ID we do talk about design ethics, right? But I think there needs to be sort of a stronger, bigger conversation about this, so that it's not just on the individuals to make sure you're bringing up the right questions at the right time, right?
And actually, just sorry, quickly piggybacking on that, because I think that issue about ethics and even behavioral justice is a term that I've kind of like, because it's going beyond just ethical application to like equity is a much, much bigger issue. There have been some really interesting papers and work, and depending on people's appetite for more academic work, but there's a framework that I teach in class still, actually, called For Good, like literally FORGOOD. Liam Delaney also is a researcher that has a whole website full of resources too. So it's a very active conversation right now that I'm also very excited and excited about, and also kind of grateful for, because I think it is surfacing many of these issues, which even the term like nudging is a familiar term that people may know from like the original book Nudge. Like the original urge behind that, it was always about nudging for good, right? So in some ways, this desire to have ethical outcomes has been baked into behavioral design, behavioral science. But yeah, with things like dark patterns, with sludge, we do need to be careful. And so, yeah, having both kind of ethical guidelines for the whole field, but also, right, like things that people can check each other about, having diversity in the room, all those things you're describing. It's something we continually need to look out for, because it can go down a very slippery path very quickly.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oops. Oh.
Yes. Just some, yeah. So again, we received a lot of questions on employing behavioral design for systemic issues. So Ruth, if you could describe taking an example of any of these large-scale systems like sustainable cities or inequities in the healthcare system or the food system, to just explain how designers can use concepts of behavioral science in designing for these systemic issues and problems.
Yeah, no, and in fact, I have a great example. Literally right now, we are 2 weeks away from the end of our semester, and there's been a workshop class that I've been helping with, which is co-run by 2 other ID faculty. So Carlos Teixeira, who's a systems design expert, and Chris Rudd, who both owns an organization, like a consulting firm, Chai by Design, which is explicitly about anti-racist design practices. And then I'm the third wheel, so I'm bringing my behavioral design lens. And what's been really interesting in that workshop is that we are focusing on exactly that. We're looking at the systemic issue of fines and fees in transportation in the city of Chicago. So working directly with, for example, the clerk's office, and kind of getting this understanding of the grounding, right? Like, what are the things that we need to be understanding, both in terms of laws and policies, but also who's impacted. So Chris, for example, has been able to bring a lot of really good and thoughtful questions and prompts, and really forcing students to look at, the ways in which fines and fees disproportionately impact people, for example, of like lower socioeconomic status, or concentrated in certain areas of Chicago. And those who don't know Chicago in particular, the south and west sides of Chicago tend to be just higher levels of Black and brown populations, who are also often on the receiving end of fewer resources, and also end up disproportionately shouldering the burden of many of these fines and fees. So that's kind of an underlying system context that we're designing into. What Carlos is then sort of helping the students to move forward is this bigger picture system understanding. So being able to identify, for example, what are some of the core infrastructures that are part of and holding these systems in place? How do we need to be thinking, for example, about the fact that I sit and I look out my window all day long when I'm working at home, and there are like 20 Amazon vans that go by every single day. But Amazon is set up outside of Chicago, and so they're actually not contributing into the Chicago, fines and fees system. So those are some of these big system level challenges that we need to be looking at. And then what I'm trying to do, kind of to more directly answer your question, is to look at, okay, well, what are the things that we need to be understanding in terms of, in some cases, really core sort of what's called choice architecture. It's a common term for like how we build solutions that are at the moment of decision making. So a great example is if you see that you're going 65 miles an hour in a 50-mile zone, that's kind of a choice architecture decision about like, oh, now I see I'm going too fast and maybe I'll slow down. So there's some solutions that come at that level. But what I'm encouraging the students to do in a case like this also is to look at what we might consider sort of the choice infrastructures. So taking this idea of infrastructure from a systems perspective, which is that, systems work because of all this underlying plumbing, essentially. But, again, in this interest of looking at designing conditions to support behavior, sometimes we need to be thinking about the choice conditions on a broader level. So for example, if somebody doesn't know how to contest a ticket, they're less likely to do so. And that can lead to inequities in the system as well. So that may be a case where when we look at designing choice conditions from a behavioral perspective, we can start to think about solutions that maybe make it either change the defaults of who gets tickets. We can start to look at how tickets are delivered, because tickets can look pretty scary. So even just something like the visual and communication design of what you receive may make you feel like, I'm a criminal, I'm on the receiving end of something really bad, rather than, oh, I actually have the opportunity to contest this because maybe what I was doing wasn't, it was for either a good reason or it wasn't as bad as they're saying. So in some ways, that's a really interesting example for me that's like very live right now about how we can start to take a systems perspective, an equity and anti-racist perspective, but also a really strong behavioral lens. And I will absolutely say, by the way, that systems challenges are hard for a reason. And that it's not like magically we bring these together and, oh, look, we solved everything for the city of Chicago. But what we are doing, I think, is coming at those challenges in really distinct and important ways that aren't just about either tweaking small behavior like speed or don't speed, but in looking and designing it more of a systems level, we're actually able to come up with and propose, and the students are arriving at really thoughtful solutions or approaches that take into consideration behavior and data, but also, again, in this interest of more equitable, longer term solutions. So we could literally spend a whole hour talking about that. And I know there are other questions to come, but I think there's a lot of really exciting potential in how to do that. And I think it really does require that both mindset and appetite for, again, like really unpacking our own expectations about what solutions look like and how we need to be reconsidering them, and testing and trying things out. They're wicked problems for a reason. It's a hard thing to be solving for, but I think like thinking from a behavioral perspective can definitely supply new ways of getting at them.
Yeah, sure. Moving forward, I was thinking maybe we can, since both of you have been in the industry for a long time, so where do you see future of behavioral design is heading? If you can shed some light on that, Asmina.
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, I think what we might be able to sort of comfortably say at this point is that this field, even though it definitely feels like a new and a baby field, is certainly growing a lot, right? It's gaining a lot of traction. I'd say there's been a lot of interest, similarly to, by the way, how design entered a lot of the industries, right? It took many years for design to now, for companies to sort of see design as a core capability in how they solve problems and serve their clients. I think that behavioral science and behavioral design is sort of on a similar trend, just a few years behind. I would say that there have been a handful of people that, you could probably count on your fingers who sort of who became sort of were responsible for making this sort of popular enough that it's now on most consultants' radars as sort of an interesting approach to try and solve people problems. And so I think that over the years, I'd only expect this to sort of grow. The community is growing. One of the things that I love about the behavioral science and design community, if you've engaged with sort of groups over LinkedIn, or in sort of, we're doing it right now as part of this event. It's been really interesting to see how people are so willing to talk about the challenges that they're encountering and what kind of problems are they, applying behavioral design to, and just sort of share each other's experiences and learn from that, right? And so I think eventually I'd imagine that this sort of becomes much more integrated into sort of yet one more approach that we can use to solve problems. At McKinsey, we like to sort of think about like several, depending on what problem you're talking about, there are several, problem solving approaches. And I see design and, behavioral design more specifically as sort of being one more lever that we're able to sort of leverage. So I think there are good things coming.
And just maybe building on that quickly too, I think the applying more behavioral insight and design to these larger level systems challenges, I think that's only going to increase. I've been having several conversations from folks at organizations like BIT, the Behavioral Insights team, for example, or Ideas 42, which are both kind of leading more public policy oriented organizations, and they're all kind of chomping at the bit to do the same thing. Like, how do we combine design and behavioral thinking in a way that's going to benefit larger populations, bigger challenges? I think that really is, it's not going to mean that we stop focusing on more of that discrete behavioral change, but there's just a lot of possibility out there.
And lastly, I guess discussion I've been seeing a lot in the chat section, just to get people started with behavioral design and behavioral science. Do you guys have any resources that people can look up? And how do you get started in the field?
Well, I have a couple off the top of my head, so I can reel those off. Two kind of newsletter websites that I find really, really useful. One is The Behavioral Scientist. Full disclosure, I've done some writing for them here and there, but they have a weekly newsletter, and it's a great compilation of all sorts of experts in the field. So, people like me who are more from the design side, harder core behavioral scientists, but all very approachable. And they also have a yearly list of like the best books of the year. So that's actually a great place just to get schooled. There's also a weekly newsletter called Habit Weekly, which sort of from a similar perspective, both of these cases, by the way, are very international too. And I've been noticing in the chat, we've had highs from like all over the globe. So this is not by any means like just a US field. There's actually a ton of really useful and interesting stuff elsewhere. So those are two kind of absolutely useful ramps in, I think, that can expose you to much, much more than we can talk about right here. There's also, I think, Asmina, you may have mentioned, there are lots of tools that exist. So the COM-B model is a well-known one that Susan Mishi, I know, is associated with. So it's COM-B if you were to search for that. But there are also tools. I mentioned the Behavioral Insights team, so they have tools and frameworks. I create tools and frameworks as part of my class. I feel like there are lots and lots of tools and frameworks out there that can also become kind of useful starting places. But yeah, Habit Weekly and Behavioral Scientist, I think, would be my top two, just because they can launch you into a bunch of other things that people might find more individually interesting, that may suit more targeted needs.
Yeah, I think, yes, Ruth. I mean, I definitely endorse. You know, I love Habit Weekly. They do a great job of sort of curating a bunch of resources too.
Yep.
So that has certainly been very helpful for me personally. I do think that Action Design Network has some interesting material that
Totally.
folks
Yep.
can, if folks are not familiar with Action Design Network, I certainly encourage people to explore that. And then I think the one of the things that I found most, and even though, you know, I'm fairly introverted, this is harder to do, but super rewarding, was to connect with people who are in the field. Like, I can't emphasize enough how open and sort of live this community is, because it is small. So if you're interested in kind of learning more about, you know, what, sorry, I'm just a little distracted here. If you're interested in sort of learning more about, you know, something that Ruth worked on, I'm sure Ruth would be willing to have you know, a conversation with you. So yeah, I think connecting with people, and then yeah, that's it.
Those were quite a good list of resources. I'm sure people are gonna find it helpful. I know we're running out of time here a bit, but I just have one last question. Is it okay if I ask that? Because
Yeah.
I saw it a lot on the chat. So just as a question, it's like, what's the difference between behavioral design versus human-centered design versus communication design? I know design in itself is such a large word, a big word with so many different definitions thrown around. It would be, yeah, just to have people get more clarity with respect to human-centered design versus behavioral design versus communication design. So if you want to go ahead with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So behavioral design, I think, really does, for me, it is design that is grounded in findings from behavioral science. So all of the experiments and findings that we may have, that there are lots of, you know, all over the globe, again, really smart people running experiments, building hypotheses about why certain people behave in certain ways and how our brains are operating. So taking that and putting it into design is where behavioral design is. Human-centered design is a little bit more grounded in you know, traditions of design itself, where it's putting human beings first. It's not like it doesn't care about behavior, but it's not necessarily as specifically grounded in the findings from a behavioral science perspective. So human-centered design, I think, has it's certainly where ID kind of got a lot of its initial grounding and has been around for quite a number of decades. So when Asmina and I were talking earlier on about how these two are really nice complements, it's partly because human-centered design has its own traditions, behavioral design has its own, and it's when they sort of fit together that we can, you know, really think about behavior both from a human way, but also building on all these findings from research. And then communication design is kind of a separate category of skills that help us to take information and communicate it really well through verbal and visual, you know, whether it's diagrams or well-chosen words. Sometimes though, when we start to see these interact, communication design can be a really effective way, for example, to communicate messages which take on a communication, or sorry, a behavioral design form. So I was using, I think, the example of parking tickets or getting ticketed from the city government as looking scary and terrifying and like hard to understand. Like somebody designed that thing to look a certain way. And so communication design can be a great set of skills that can help to create better design that changes behavior, but you're using those communication design skills in the interest of something which is driving, you know, more thoughtful communication, essentially. So they all, if you think of design as like creating things based on knowledge, they're just partly coming from different sources of knowledge. But in combining them together, then we can start to, you know, make uses of communication design in a human-centered context or human-centered design in a behavioral design context. I hope that makes sense. You know, design is one of the most complicated words we can think about.
Well, thanks everyone for coming to our talk today. I just want to end on a couple closing notes here and let you know about some other things that are coming up soon. So you can learn more about behavioral design specifically at, some of the links that were provided in the chat, if you can get around our trolls here today. And also, that Ruth and Asmina cited in the conversation. But in addition, wanted to let you know that we have an event coming up this Monday, which is our 4th annual Lucas J. Daniel lecture. And Erica Allen will be speaking at that. It's time to write for Earth Month. Earth Day is actually this Friday. So at ID, we don't just celebrate Earth Day on Friday. We will continue to celebrate sustainability and Earth Month year round. So just to learn more about how we think about sustainability and sustainable systems at ID would be a great event to attend. You can attend it in person, actually. That will be at the Institute of Design on the 2nd floor of the Kaplan Institute at our MDes campus in Chicago. And if you go to the registration, which you can get to by going to our events page on our website, you can also stream it virtually if you're not able to attend in person in Chicago. So that's one coming up. And then another one that we have coming up is the end of year show, which is happening Friday, May 13th. This is where you really get to see great student work from the Institute of Design, get a better handle on what happens at ID and what we mean by design at ID. So look forward to seeing you at those upcoming events. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we will see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.